Maya's hands trembled as she reread the note, though whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell. The careful script seemed to burn against her fingertips, educated penmanship that didn't belong in these wild mountains, where most folks barely scratched out their names on supply invoices. The initials meant nothing to her, yet something about them stirred a memory just out of reach, like trying to catch snowflakes in the dark. She stuffed the note deep into her coat pocket and shouldered the canvas bag, its weight both a blessing and a curse. The preserved venison alone would feed her family for a week, but accepting it felt like stepping into a snare she couldn't see. Maya had learned the hard way that nothing came free in this world, especially not kindness. The cabin door groaned on frozen hinges as she slipped inside, immediately hit by the familiar cocktail of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the sour smell of too many people living in too small a space. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward her, her whole world condensed into faces that looked more gaunt each passing day. "Did you catch anything, Maya?" 10-year-old Emma's voice carried that careful hopefulness that broke Maya's heart daily. Emma had learned not to expect much, but she hadn't quite given up asking. Better than that. Maya forced brightness into her voice as she set the bag on their makeshift table, 2 sawhorses supporting a sheet of plywood. "We're having a feast tonight." The younger ones erupted in cheers, but 13-year-old Lucas watched her with 2 knowing eyes. He'd grown up fast these past 2 years, fast enough to recognize the worry lines Maya tried to hide behind forced smiles. "Where'd you get it?" he asked quietly, while the others crowded around the bag. "Does it matter?" Maya began dividing the meat into portions, her movements sharp with practiced efficiency. "We need food. We have food. It matters if someone's gonna want something back for it." Smart boy. Too smart. Maya wished she could protect him from that kind of thinking, but survival had stripped away the luxury of childhood innocence. "I'll handle it," she said, meeting his gaze. "I always do." Lucas didn't look convinced, but he nodded and turned to help 8-year-old David portion out the dried apples. Even David had learned to make food stretch, counting pieces with the solemnity of a bank clerk. As Maya prepared their evening meal on the ancient wood stove, patched with coffee cans and held together by prayer, her mind kept drifting to those boot prints in the snow. Someone had circled their cabin multiple times, studying it, learning their routines. The thought made her skin crawl. She'd chosen this abandoned mining camp precisely because it felt impenetrable, a maze of collapsed tunnels and rotting structures that would deter casual explorers. The nearest road lay 8 miles down a treacherous mountain trail that became impassable for vehicles after the first heavy snow. Even on foot, it was a dangerous journey that had claimed plenty of lives over the years. Yet someone had made that journey. Someone who moved through these mountains like he belonged here. Your parents would be proud. The words haunted her as she watched 5-year-old Sophie carefully count her apple pieces, making sure each sibling got exactly the same amount. Their parents. Maya barely let herself think about them anymore. It hurt too much and accomplished nothing. The official search had been called off after 3 weeks when the spring thaw revealed no bodies. Maya had told herself they'd probably fallen through ice on one of the hidden streams that riddled these peaks. Their remains washed away in the mountain runoff. But what if that wasn't true? What if someone knew what really happened that night? As darkness crept across the mountains and the younger children settled into their shared sleeping area, a nest of salvaged blankets and worn sleeping bags, Maya made her decision. She had to know. The not knowing had eaten at her for 732 days, and now someone was offering answers. She waited until the soft breathing of sleep filled the cabin, then slipped outside into the brutal cold. The old mine shaft lay a 1/4 mile up the ridge, a black mouth carved into the mountainside where desperate men had once chased fool's gold into the earth's belly. Maya's breath came in sharp puffs as she climbed, her boots crunching through snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the emerging stars. Each step felt like a choice between safety and truth, between the devil she knew and the one she didn't. The mine entrance yawned ahead, and Maya caught the faint glow of firelight dancing on stone walls. Someone was waiting, someone who claimed to know about her parents, who'd been watching her family, who moved through these mountains like a ghost. Maya's hand instinctively moved to the hunting knife at her belt, a blade she'd learned to use when desperation demanded it. She'd fought tooth and nail to keep her family together this long. If this mysterious SB thought he could use their desperation against them, he was about to learn exactly how fierce a cornered wolf could be. She stepped into the mine. The first thing Maya noticed was the warmth. Heat radiated from a carefully built fire near the mine's entrance, the flames casting dancing shadows on walls that hadn't seen light for decades. Someone had arranged flat stones in a circle, created a proper seating area with split logs. This wasn't a hastily assembled meeting place, but something prepared with care. The second thing she noticed was the man himself. Silas Blackwood, because it had to be him, sat perfectly still on the far side of the fire, hands resting loosely on his knees. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with steel-grey hair and a face carved by weather and hard living, but his eyes held a depth that made Maya's breath catch. They were familiar somehow, though she was certain she'd never seen this man before in her life. Maya. His voice was gravelly but gentle, like he was greeting an old friend rather than a desperate teenager clutching a hunting knife. "Thank you for coming. You said you knew my parents." She stayed near the entrance, every muscle coiled for flight. "Prove it." Silas reached slowly into his coat pocket and withdrew something small. He set it on a flat stone between them, the firelight catching metal and making it gleam. Maya's knees nearly buckled. Her father's compass, the antique brass one he'd carried on every hunting trip, every scouting expedition, the one he'd promised would be hers someday when she was old enough to need it. "Where did you get that?" Her voice cracked despite her efforts to stay strong. "He gave it to me the night they disappeared," Silas said quietly. "Asked me to keep it safe. Said if anything happened to them, I should watch over their children." "That's impossible. You're lying." But even as she said it, Maya felt the words ring hollow. The compass was real. She could see the familiar scratches on its surface, the dent from when her father had dropped it down a ravine when she was 12. "Your mother's name was Sarah Chen before she married your father. She grew up in Seattle, went to nursing school at UW, met James Caldwell when he was working construction to pay for his forestry degree." Silas's voice carried the weight of truth. Sarah had a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her left shoulder blade. James could whistle any bird call you wanted to hear, but his favorite was the hermit thrush because that's what was singing the first time he kissed your mother. Maya's hand flew to her throat. These weren't details someone could guess or overhear in town gossip. These were intimate family memories, the kind of stories parents shared with their children during quiet moments. "Why didn't you come forward before now?" she whispered. "Why let us struggle for 2 years?" Silas's expression darkened. "Because the people who killed your parents are still looking for something they believe James hid before he died. Coming forward would have put targets on all your backs, bigger ones than you already have. Killed?" The mine walls seemed to spin around her. "They weren't lost in the blizzard?" "Sit down, child. Please." Silas gestured to a log across from him. "What I'm about to tell you, it's going to change everything." Maya found herself moving forward, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. She perched on the edge of the log, close enough to grab her father's compass if needed, far enough to bolt for the entrance. "Your parents weren't just simple mountain folk trying to make a living," Silas began. "Your father stumbled onto something up here in these mountains, something worth killing for. And the night they disappeared, he called me in a panic, said they were being followed. He was trying to get your mother to safety when—" Silas's weathered hands clenched into fists. "I found their bodies 3 days later, buried under an avalanche that was triggered deliberately. Took me another week to dig them out and give them a proper burial." Maya's world tilted sideways. You buried them? They're not lost?" "There's a peaceful spot about 5 miles north of here. Overlooks the valley they both loved. I can take you there when the spring melt comes." His voice gentled. "But Maya, there's more. The people who killed them, they never found what they were looking for, and lately there've been signs that they're getting ready to expand their search." "What kind of signs?" "Strangers asking questions in Copper Falls, government vehicles on the old mining roads. Someone's been watching your cabin, and it's not just me." Silas leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Your father hid something valuable up here. Something that could either save your family or destroy it completely. The question is, are you ready to learn the truth about who your parents really were?" Outside the mine, wind howled through the peaks like the voices of the dead. Maya stared into the fire, feeling her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. For 2 years she'd built her life around one simple truth: she had to protect her siblings. Now this stranger was offering her answers she'd craved and possibilities that terrified her. Her father's compass gleamed in the firelight, waiting. Maya stared at the compass until her eyes burned, as if she could somehow force it to reveal all its secrets through sheer will. The familiar weight of responsibility pressed against her chest. 6 sleeping children who depended on her for everything, who trusted her to keep them safe and fed and together. For 2 years that responsibility had been her anchor, the one certainty in a world that had stripped away everything else. Now, even that certainty felt like shifting sand. What did he hide? The words scraped past her throat like broken glass. What was worth killing my parents for? Silas reached into his coat again, this time withdrawing a yellowed piece of paper covered in her father's careful handwriting. "A map," he said simply, "to the largest undiscovered mineral deposit in the Montana Rockies. Your father was conducting a geological survey for the state when he found traces of rare earth metals, enough to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Maya's hands shook as she took the paper. The familiar loops and angles of her father's penmanship swam before her eyes, mixed with elevation markers and geological symbols that might as well have been written in a foreign language. But at the bottom, in her father's careful script, were words that made her heart stop. "For my children's future. May this give them the freedom I never had." "He was going to use this to get you all out of here," Silas continued, his voice gentle but urgent. "Buy land somewhere safe. Give you kids proper educations, make sure you never had to scrape by again." But the wrong people found out about his discovery. A distant sound froze the words in Maya's throat, the low rumble of snowmobile engines echoing off the mountain walls. Silas was on his feet instantly, his weathered face grim as he kicked snow over their fire. "They're early," he muttered, then grabbed Maya's arm. "How many ways out of this mine?" What?" The engines were getting closer, their mechanical growl alien in the pristine wilderness. 3, maybe 4 old shafts, but most of them are collapsed. "Show me. Now." Maya's mind reeled as she led him deeper into the mine's shadowy tunnels, her flashlight beam dancing across rotting support timbers and walls that wept with mineral deposits. The map crinkled in her pocket with each step, her father's final gift, and possibly his death warrant. "There," she whispered, pointing to a narrow passage that angled downward into darkness. "It comes out near the old equipment shed, but it's unstable. Better than the alternative." Silas pressed something cold and heavy into her hand, a set of keys attached to a small leather pouch. "My cabin is 8 miles northeast, hidden in a grove of white pines near Devil's Creek. If something happens to me, take your siblings there. There's food, supplies, everything you'll need." The snowmobile engines had stopped, replaced by voices echoing from the mine entrance. Male voices, speaking in clipped, professional tones that made Maya's skin crawl. "Why are you helping us?" she whispered. Silas met her eyes in the flashlight's glow, and for a moment his weathered features softened into something that looked almost like pain. "Because I made a promise to your father, and because—" He hesitated, then pulled something from around his neck, a thin gold chain with a small pendant. Even in the dim light, Maya could see it was a match to the one her mother had worn every day of her life. "Because you're my granddaughter, Maya. Your mother was my daughter." The words hit her like a physical blow. Maya stumbled backward, her mind struggling to process this impossible revelation. Her mother had always claimed to be an orphan, had never spoken of family beyond vague mentions of growing up in foster care. That's impossible. Sarah ran away when she was 17, Silas said quickly, the voices from the entrance growing closer. We had a fight about her wanting to leave the mountains for college. I was stubborn, too proud to go after her. By the time I swallowed my pride and tracked her down, she was already married to your father. I watched from a distance, told myself she was better off without me. The sound of footsteps echoed from the main tunnel now, accompanied by the harsh beams of tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness. Go, Silas urged, pushing her toward the narrow passage. Take the map to someone you trust, a lawyer maybe, or a journalist. Don't let them bury the truth with your parents. Come with me, Maya whispered desperately. I can't lose you too. They're here for me, child, not you. As long as you stay hidden, you're safe. His eyes were fierce now, burning with protective determination. But Maya, that map isn't just your inheritance. It's proof of why your parents died. Use it wisely. The voices were close enough now that Maya could make out individual words. Secure the perimeter and no witnesses, that made terror spike through her veins like ice water. Her grandfather, this stranger who was somehow family, squeezed her shoulder once, then melted back into the shadows toward the approaching threat. Maya clutched the keys and map to her chest and ran. Maya burst from the mine shaft's hidden exit, gasping for air, her lungs burning from the frantic crawl through unstable tunnels. Behind her, the mountains swallowed whatever sounds might have escaped. No gunshots, no shouts, just the terrible silence of snow absorbing secrets. She pressed herself against the rusted equipment shed, clutching Silas's keys until the metal bit into her palm. Your grandfather. The words hammered against her skull like physical blows. How could her mother, practical, honest Sarah, have hidden something so enormous? Maya had spent countless nights as a child begging for stories about extended family, dreaming of grandparents who might send birthday cards or Christmas presents. Her mother had always deflected with gentle lies about having no one, about Maya's siblings being all the family they needed. Now she understood why. Sarah hadn't been protecting herself from painful memories. She'd been protecting her children from becoming targets. Maya's hands shook as she studied the keys Silas had pressed into her palm. Heavy, old-fashioned things that spoke of solid doors and sturdy locks, a refuge he'd prepared, supplies he'd gathered, all for grandchildren he'd watched from a distance while they slowly starved. The bitter irony twisted in her gut. While she'd been setting snares for rabbits and trading her mother's jewelry for flour, her own grandfather had been living 8 miles away with everything they needed. 8 miles. She could have walked it in good weather, could have found help months ago if she'd only known. But knowing would have meant exposure. Safety would have meant painting targets on their backs larger than the ones they apparently already wore. Use it wisely, he'd said about the map. As if she knew how to use geological surveys and mineral rights, as if she understood the world of lawyers and journalists and people who killed for mining claims. Maya was 17 years old, and her greatest achievement was keeping 6 children fed through 2 Montana winters. She knew how to skin rabbits and patch holes with tin cans and make soap from rendered fat. She didn't know how to avenge her parents' murder. Maya began moving toward home through the familiar maze of collapsed mining structures, but each step felt like walking through quicksand. The map crackled against her ribs, where she'd tucked it inside her coat, a piece of paper that was supposedly worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Worth enough that people had killed for it, worth enough that they'd kill again. Her father's handwriting. Even in her brief glimpse by firelight, those careful letters had been unmistakably his. The same hand that had helped her with math homework and left encouraging notes in her lunchbox. He'd known he was in danger when he drew those elevation markers and geological symbols. He'd known someone might kill him for what he'd discovered in these mountains. And he'd hidden the truth anyway, chosen the risk over the safety of ignorance. Just like she was doing now. Maya stopped walking, snow crunching under her boots, as the full weight of choice settled on her shoulders. She could take this map to the authorities, find that lawyer or journalist Silas had mentioned. She could pursue the truth about her parents' deaths, claim whatever inheritance her father had tried to leave them. Or she could destroy it, burn the map, throw Silas's keys down a mine shaft, and pretend this night had never happened. Take her siblings and disappear deeper into the wilderness where no mining claims or government agents could follow. They'd been invisible for 2 years already. They could stay invisible forever. The first choice offered justice, answers, possibly enough money to give her siblings real futures, college educations and warm homes, and all the security Maya had dreamed of providing them. The second choice offered survival, continued poverty but continued safety, no one hunting them for maps they didn't possess, no one viewing 6 children as acceptable casualties in pursuit of mineral rights. Maya thought about Lucas's 2 knowing eyes, about Emma's careful hopefulness, about 5-year-old Sophie counting apple pieces to make sure everyone got equal shares. They trusted her absolutely, followed her into this frozen wilderness because they believed she could keep them safe. What if she was wrong? What if pursuing her father's legacy got them all killed? But what if hiding accomplished nothing? What if whoever had murdered her parents eventually found them anyway? Decided that loose ends needed tying up regardless of whether the Caldwell children knew anything about geological surveys? The cabin came into view through the trees, dark windows revealing nothing of the precious lives sleeping inside. Maya stood at the edge of the clearing, paralyzed by possibilities. Justice or safety, truth or survival, her parents' legacy or her siblings' lives. She didn't know if she was strong enough to choose. She didn't know if she was strong enough to live with either choice. The map burned against her ribs like a brand. Her grandfather's keys grew heavy as anchors in her palm, and Maya Caldwell stood frozen in the snow, terrified that any step forward might be the wrong one. A sound from inside the cabin shattered Maya's paralysis. Sophie's voice calling out in the darkness, high and frightened. "Maya? Maya, where are you?" The fear in her little sister's cry cut through every hesitation like a blade. Maya was moving before conscious thought caught up, her boots carrying her across the clearing in long strides. She burst through the cabin door to find Sophie standing in the middle of the main room in her patched nightgown, tears streaming down her face. "I had a bad dream," Sophie whispered, launching herself into Maya's arms. "There were monsters in the snow and they took you away, and we couldn't find you anywhere." Maya held her sister tight, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and soap that clung to Sophie's dark hair. Over the little girl's shoulder, she could see the other children stirring. Lucas sitting up in the corner where he claimed the warmest spot. Emma's concerned face peering over the edge of the loft where she slept with the twins. "It's okay, sweetheart," Maya murmured, but the words felt like lies on her tongue. Nothing was okay. Everything she thought she knew about their situation had crumbled in the span of a single conversation. It was just a dream. But even as she spoke, Maya's mind was racing. The men with tactical flashlights weren't a dream. The map, pressing against her ribs, wasn't a nightmare that would fade with morning light. Her parents' murder, murder, wasn't something she could protect her siblings from by pretending it hadn't happened. "Maya?" Lucas's voice carried a note of alert wariness that made her stomach clench. At 14, he was old enough to read the tension in her posture, smart enough to know she was hiding something significant. "Where were you? You said you'd be back before dark." She met his eyes across the dim cabin, saw the questions forming behind his carefully neutral expression. Lucas had been asking harder questions lately, pushing against the boundaries of the careful stories she'd constructed to explain their situation. He deserved the truth. They all did. But the truth might get them killed. "I was checking the snares," Maya said, settling Sophie more comfortably in her arms. The lie came easily after 2 years of practice, but it tasted bitter. Lost track of time. Lucas's gaze flicked to her empty hands, to the absence of rabbit or squirrel that should have accompanied a successful trap check. His mouth tightened, but he didn't challenge her directly. Not in front of the younger ones. "Go back to sleep, everyone," Maya said softly. "Morning will come early." But as her siblings gradually settled back into their makeshift beds, Maya remained standing in the center of the cabin, Sophie's warm weight in her arms anchoring her to the present moment. This was what mattered. This was what she'd fought for every day since their parents disappeared, the ability to keep her family together, safe, protected from forces beyond their control. The map in her coat seemed to pulse against her ribs like a second heartbeat, full of dangerous possibilities. What if the money could buy them real safety instead of this precarious existence? What if her father's discovery could give them the resources to disappear properly, to start over somewhere far from Montana's unforgiving peaks? College funds for Lucas and Emma, medical care for 10-year-old Michael's persistent cough, warm clothes and steady meals, and all the normal childhood experiences Maya had been unable to provide. What if justice for her parents was worth the risk? Sophie's breathing had evened out into the deep rhythms of sleep, but Maya couldn't bring herself to put her sister down. The weight of the little girl in her arms felt like the only real thing in a world suddenly full of shadows and secrets. Your grandfather? Even now, the words seemed impossible. But the pendant around Silas's neck had been identical to their mother's, a small silver compass rose that Sarah had touched whenever she was nervous or thinking deeply. Maya remembered playing with it as a toddler, fascinated by the way it caught the light. Her mother had been someone's daughter, someone's child who had run away at 17, the same age Maya was now, seeking freedom and independence in a world that seemed determined to trap young women in circumstances beyond their control. Had Sarah ever stood in a moment like this one, paralyzed by choices that seemed equally impossible? Had she ever held the weight of other people's futures in her hands and wondered if she was strong enough to choose correctly? Maya looked around the cabin, at the patched walls and makeshift furniture, at the careful rationing of their dwindling food supplies, at 6 children who trusted her completely to keep them alive in a wilderness that showed no mercy. She thought about the tactical flashlights cutting through mine-shaft darkness, about voices discussing no witnesses in professional tones that suggested this wasn't their first time eliminating problems. The map crinkled as Maya shifted Sophie to her other arm, and suddenly her choice crystallized with painful clarity. There was no going back to ignorance. The men in the mine had changed everything, made hiding impossible whether she wanted to or not. Her only option now was moving forward into whatever came next. Maya kissed Sophie's forehead and finally made her decision. Maya carried Sophie to her sleeping spot and tucked the worn blanket around her small frame, then moved quietly to where Lucas lay pretending to sleep. His eyes opened immediately when she crouched beside him. "We need to talk," she whispered. "Outside. 5 minutes." She slipped back into the cold night air, her breath forming clouds in the moonlight. Lucas emerged moments later, pulling on his oversized coat, one of their father's old jackets that swallowed his lanky frame. "What's really happening?" he asked without preamble. In the pale light, his face looked older than his 14 years, carved by the same harsh responsibilities that had aged Maya beyond her 17 winters. Maya studied her brother's expression, weighing how much truth he could handle, but the map against her ribs reminded her that partial truths had already proven dangerous. "The men who took Mom and Dad," she said quietly. "They're back." Lucas went very still. They'd never spoken directly about their parents' fate. Maya had always maintained the fiction that Thomas and Sarah Caldwell had simply been caught in the blizzard, victims of Montana's brutal weather rather than something more sinister. "You saw them?" "I heard them." Maya pulled Silas's keys from her pocket, the metal catching moonlight like small silver promises. "We can't stay here anymore, Luke. It's not safe." "Where would we go?" The question carried the weight of 2 years' worth of careful survival, of established routines and familiar dangers. This cabin might be drafty and isolated, but it was home. It was theirs. Maya thought about the white pines near Devil's Creek, about the grandfather she'd never known watching them from a distance. There's a place, someone who might help. Someone you trust? The word hung between them like a challenge, Trust was a luxury they'd abandoned when their parents vanished, when Maya realized the only person she could rely on was herself. But Silas had known her father's handwriting, had worn their mother's pendant, had put himself in danger to warn her about approaching threats. More importantly, he'd given her choices instead of making decisions for her. "I think so," Maya said finally. "But Lucas, if we do this, if we leave here, everything changes. We can't come back." Her brother was quiet for a long moment, his breath forming steady clouds in the frigid air. When he spoke again, his voice carried a determination that reminded Maya painfully of their father. "The twins are getting sick again," Lucas said. "Michael's cough is worse, and Emma won't admit it, but she's been giving most of her food to Sophie. We're not going to make it through another winter like this one." Maya felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. She wasn't carrying this decision alone anymore. "It's dangerous," she warned. "People died for what we're about to do. People die from starvation too." Lucas met her eyes steadily. "And from cold, and from infections we can't treat, and from pretending we're invisible when we're just slowly disappearing." A sound from the tree line made them both freeze, the soft crunch of snow under careful footsteps. Maya's hand instinctively went to the hunting knife at her belt, but a familiar voice called out quietly, "Easy there, child. It's just me." Silas emerged from the shadows, and Maya's relief was so sharp it almost buckled her knees. "I thought the men at the mine—" "Gone for now," Silas said grimly. "But they'll be back with more people, better equipment. We've got maybe 12 hours before they start searching in earnest." He looked between Maya and Lucas, taking in the family conference with knowing eyes. "You told him some of it." Maya straightened, suddenly aware that she was about to trust this man with everything that mattered to her. "Are you really our grandfather?" Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, creased and faded, but clearly showing a younger version of himself standing beside a teenage girl with Sarah's distinctive dark hair and stubborn chin. The girl was laughing at something outside the camera's range, her whole face bright with joy Maya had never seen in her mother's careful expressions. "She was happy here, before things went wrong between us," Silas said softly. "Loved these mountains like they were part of her soul. I always hoped she'd come back someday, bring her children to see where their mother grew up." Maya stared at the photograph, seeing her own features reflected in the girl's face. The same determined jaw, the same eyes that missed nothing. Her mother as she'd never known her, young, carefree, unaware of the hardships that lay ahead. "What do we need to do?" Lucas asked, and Maya realized her brother had made the same decision she had. Trust was a risk, but so was everything else. Silas smiled then, the expression transforming his weathered features into something unexpectedly warm. "Pack light, but pack everything you can't replace. We leave in an hour." Maya looked back at the cabin one last time, then nodded. "Let's wake the others." The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of desperation. Maya moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her hands selecting items while her mind catalogued everything they'd have to abandon. 2 years of survival reduced to what 6 children could carry through mountain wilderness in the dead of night. "Wake up, sweetheart." Maya's voice was gentle as she shook Emma's shoulder. "We're going on an adventure." At 13, Emma was old enough to recognize euphemism when she heard it, but she helped anyway, rousing 9-year-old twins Danny and David with quiet urgency while Maya coaxed 10-year-old Michael from his restless sleep. His cough had worsened over the past week, each rattling breath a reminder of their medical limitations. Sophie whimpered when Maya lifted her from the warm nest of blankets. "I don't want to go outside. It's cold and dark and the monsters—" "No monsters," Maya whispered, though her eyes found Lucas by the door, standing watch with their father's old rifle. "Just a new place to sleep, somewhere warmer." The lie came easily, but packing proved more brutal than Maya had anticipated. Her mother's jewelry, already mostly traded for flour and medicine, fit in a small cloth bag. The photograph of their parents on their wedding day went into Emma's coat pocket. Medical supplies, what remained of their food stores, spare clothes for the youngest ones. But the books had to stay. The wooden toys their father had carved during long winter evenings. The quilt their mother had pieced together from fabric scraps, too bulky to carry but too precious to abandon without breaking something inside Maya's chest. "Ready?" Silas appeared in the doorway like a phantom, his eyes taking in the organized chaos of their departure. He carried a pack that looked military in its efficiency, and Maya noticed he'd changed clothes, darker colors that would blend with night shadows. "The twins need help." Emma's voice was steady despite her obvious confusion about their midnight evacuation. She'd dressed Danny and David in layers, understanding intuitively that warmth mattered more than comfort on whatever journey lay ahead. Silas nodded and moved toward the boys with surprising gentleness. "Can you brave explorers handle a nighttime hike? We're going to see some country your mama used to love." Danny, always the more cautious twin, pressed closer to David. "Are we coming back?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Maya found herself looking at Lucas, then at Silas, then at the cabin that had sheltered them through 24 months of isolation and fear. "We're going home," she said finally, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "Maybe not back here, but home." They formed a strange procession through the moonlit forest, Silas leading with Michael riding piggyback to spare the boys' labored breathing, Maya carrying Sophie while Emma helped steady the twins over rough terrain. Lucas brought up the rear, alert for sounds of pursuit that might signal their midnight departure had been observed. The familiar landmarks of Maya's hunting territory fell away behind them as Silas chose a route she'd never traveled, higher into the peaks, following game trails that seemed designed for creatures more sure-footed than humans burdened with sleepy children and desperate circumstances. "Where exactly are we going?" Maya asked during their second rest stop. Sophie had fallen back asleep against her shoulder, but the twins were beginning to drag despite Emma's encouraging words. "My winter cabin," Silas replied, adjusting his grip on Michael, "about 3 miles northwest. Built it in a place most folks can't find even when they're looking." Maya thought about the tactical flashlights, about professional voices discussing elimination strategies. Will it be enough? If they're really searching? "Child," Silas's voice carried decades of mountain survival. "I've been invisible in these peaks for 30 years. Trust me when I say I know how to keep a family hidden." The word family sent an unexpected jolt through Maya's exhaustion. For 2 years, family had meant the 6 of them against an indifferent world. The possibility of expanding that circle, of sharing responsibility with someone who actually wanted to help rather than separate or institutionalize them, felt almost too dangerous to consider. But with each step away from their abandoned cabin, Maya felt something she'd nearly forgotten: hope. Fragile and terrifying, but unmistakably real. "There," Silas whispered as they crested a ridge. "Home." Below them sat a cabin that belonged in fairy tales, stone foundation, log walls that spoke of careful craftsmanship, windows that promised warmth and light. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy spirals, and Maya realized Silas had prepared for their arrival. Sophie stirred in her arms. "It looks like Grandpa's house," she murmured drowsily. Maya's breath caught. Her little sister was too young to remember their paternal grandfather, who died when Sophie was barely 3, but somehow the description felt exactly right. "Yes," Maya whispered, finally understanding what trust might feel like. "It does." The warmth hit them, like a physical embrace as Silas pushed open the heavy wooden door. Maya stepped across the threshold and immediately understood why Sophie had mentioned their grandfather. The cabin radiated the same sense of quiet strength and careful attention to comfort that had defined Grandpa Caldwell's house in those distant memories before everything went wrong. But the comfort lasted exactly 30 seconds. "Down! Everyone down!" Silas's voice cracked like a whip as he lunged for the oil lamp, plunging them into darkness. Through the windows, Maya caught the sweep of flashlight beams cutting through the forest they'd just traveled, professional, methodical, close enough that she could hear voices carrying on the cold air. Tracks leading this direction. Check every structure. No witnesses. Sophie whimpered against Maya's shoulder as her siblings pressed against her in the sudden darkness. Maya's mind reeled. They'd been so careful, following Silas's route through terrain that seemed impassable. But somehow, the searchers had tracked them anyway. "The root cellar," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Under the kitchen table. Take them down and don't make a sound until I come for you." "What about you?" Maya's question came out sharper than intended, fear making her voice tight. "I'm going to buy you time." Silas was already moving toward what looked like a gun cabinet, his movements carrying the fluid efficiency of someone who'd prepared for this moment. "Maya, if something happens to me, there's a map in the cellar. Your father's handwriting. Follow it." The flashlight beams were closer now, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. Maya could see at least 3 separate lights moving in coordinated patterns through the trees. Her greatest fear crystallized with brutal clarity, not just discovery, but what discovery would mean. These weren't social workers coming to split up her family. These were the people who'd murdered her parents. "Emma, take Sophie." Maya's training kicked in, the same survival instincts that had kept them alive for 2 years. "Lucas, help the twins into the cellar. Move." Her siblings responded with the practiced quiet of children who'd learned that silence meant survival. Emma guided Sophie toward the kitchen while Lucas lifted Danny, David clinging to his brother's coat. Michael's cough had worsened from the cold Mountaineer, but he pressed his face against Maya's shoulder to muffle the sound. The root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor concealed beneath the kitchen table, and Maya understood immediately why Silas had chosen this refuge. The space below was larger than expected, lined with stone that would muffle sound and stocked with supplies that spoke of long-term planning. This wasn't a hiding place, it was a fortress. But as Maya settled Michael against the far wall and helped Emma arrange the younger children in the darkest corner, she realized the terrible mathematics of their situation. 7 people in a space meant for storage. If the searchers were thorough, if they brought dogs, if they decided to burn the cabin to flush out any occupants. "Maya." Lucas's whisper carried a note of adult understanding that made her chest tight. "If they find us—" "They won't." But even as she spoke, Maya was calculating distances, exits, possibilities. The cellar had another opening, a narrow passage that led toward what looked like a natural cave system. Silas had prepared multiple escape routes. Above them, heavy footsteps crossed the cabin floor. Professional voices, too quiet for Maya to make out individual words, but loud enough to confirm her worst fears. The searchers weren't just looking, they were inside. Sophie's breathing hitched toward a sob, and Maya immediately pulled her sister into her arms, covering the little girl's mouth with gentle fingers. Around them, her siblings had gone completely still, understanding without words that their lives depended on absolute silence. Everything they'd learned was being tested. 2 years of survival skills, of reading danger in forest sounds, of moving without detection through wilderness terrain, but also deeper lessons about family, about sacrifice, about the weight of keeping people alive when the world seemed determined to destroy them. The map Silas had mentioned pressed against Maya's consciousness like a promise and a threat, her father's handwriting leading toward answers that had already cost 2 lives, the treasure that could buy them real safety or get them all killed in the pursuit. Above them, something crashed. Glass breaking, furniture overturned, the sounds of a thorough search conducted by people who didn't care about property damage. Maya made a decision in that moment, surrounded by 6 terrified children in a stone cellar beneath a stranger's cabin. Whatever her father had discovered, whatever fortune lay hidden in these mountains, she would find it. Not for the money, but for the power it represented. The ability to disappear completely, to buy safety instead of constantly running from danger. But first, they had to survive the next hour. A new voice joined the ones above, carrying clearly through the floorboards. "Blackwood's here somewhere. His truck's still warm." Maya's blood turned to ice water. They had Silas. Everything was about to change. The voice that came next made Maya's world collapse. Found the kids' tracks. Fresh snow, maybe an hour old. They're here. Through the stone walls of the cellar, she heard boots moving with purpose across the floor above. Not searching anymore, hunting. The difference was unmistakable to someone who'd spent 2 years listening for the sounds that meant death. Michael's cough built in his chest like a time bomb. Maya pressed her hand gently over his mouth, feeling his small body shaking with the effort to stay silent. His fever had spiked during their midnight hike, and now his breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that seemed to echo in the confined space. Please, she thought desperately, not now, not when we're this close. Basement access somewhere. The voice was directly overhead now, separated from them by maybe 8 inches of floorboard, and the kitchen table Silas had positioned to conceal the trapdoor. Emma had gone rigid beside her, both twins pressed against her sides like they were trying to disappear into her body. Sophie whimpered so quietly Maya felt it more than heard it, and Lucas had moved to the narrow passage that led deeper into the mountain, ready to lead them into whatever darkness lay beyond. Then the sound Maya had been dreading, Michael's cough, finally broke free. The small, suppressed noise might as well have been a gunshot in the sudden silence that followed. Above them, the footsteps stopped completely. Did you hear that? Maya's mind raced through impossible calculations. The passage Lucas had found. She could see maybe 15 feet before it curved into blackness. Unknown terrain, potentially impassable with the younger children, but certain death if they stayed. She was gathering Sophie into her arms when the kitchen table scraped across the floor above. Light flooded the cellar as the trapdoor was yanked open. Maya found herself staring up into the beam of a tactical flashlight, her siblings frozen around her like deer caught in headlights. Beyond the glare, she could make out a man's silhouette, professional gear, military bearing, and something in his posture that spoke of violence as a tool rather than a last resort. Well, well. The voice carried satisfaction and something darker. The Caldwell children. You've been harder to find than expected. Maya's hand found the hunting knife at her belt, knowing even as she touched it how useless the gesture was. 6 children against trained killers. The same people who'd eliminated her parents with professional efficiency. Where's the old man? Another voice demanded. Before Maya could respond, a sound echoed from the main room, something between a groan and a curse. Silas, hurt but alive. Maya's relief lasted exactly until she understood what his capture meant. No rescue was coming, no adult intervention, no grandfather to share the terrible weight of keeping her family safe. They were alone again, just like they'd been for 2 years. Except this time, hiding wasn't an option. Bring them up. The first man gestured with his flashlight. All of them, nice and slow. Maya looked at Lucas, saw her own desperation reflected in his eyes. The passage behind them remained their only chance, but that meant abandoning any hope of helping Silas. It meant running into unknown darkness with sick children and no supplies, hoping the mountain would be kinder than the men with guns. Sophie clung to her neck as Maya stood slowly, her mind working through scenarios that all ended badly. Emma helped the twins to their feet while Michael leaned heavily against Lucas, his breathing labored enough that Maya wondered if he could manage another desperate flight through wilderness terrain. As they climbed from the cellar, Maya saw the full scope of their destruction. Silas sat zip-tied to a kitchen chair, blood running from a cut above his eye, but his expression still defiant. The cabin had been systematically torn apart, furniture overturned, supplies scattered, the careful sanctuary destroyed with methodical thoroughness. 3 men, armed and professional. Radio equipment that suggested backup was available, and in the corner, something that made Maya's stomach drop, the bag they'd abandoned at their old cabin, containing her mother's remaining jewelry and the few precious photographs they hadn't been able to carry. The men had found their refuge hours ago. They'd been waiting. The map, the leader said without preamble. Your father's research. Where is it? Maya met Silas's eyes across the destroyed room and saw him shake his head almost imperceptibly. But she also saw something else. the corner of paper protruding from beneath the overturned couch, the map he'd mentioned, close enough to grab if she could create a distraction, if she was willing to risk everything on a desperate gamble. "I don't know what you're talking about," Maya said, shifting Sophie's weight and taking a half step toward the couch. The man smiled, and Maya realized their situation had just become infinitely worse. "Then, I guess we'll have to ask your siblings." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Maya watched the leader's eyes move deliberately from Emma to the twins, lingering on Michael's labored breathing with the cold assessment of someone calculating which pressure point would break her fastest. "No." The word escaped Maya's lips before she could stop it, raw and desperate. "Leave them alone." "Then you know what I want." The man stepped closer, and Maya caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with gun oil. Not mountain people, not locals. These were professionals who'd traveled here for one specific purpose. Your father was very thorough in his research. 30 years of geological surveys, mineral assessments, historical claims, all leading to one location. Maya's mind reeled. 30 years. Her father would have been younger than she was now when he started. "I don't understand." "Of course you don't." The leader's voice carried patronizing patience. David Caldwell was 17 when he found the first Spanish markers. Smart enough to keep quiet about it, spend decades verifying the location before he made his move. Smart enough to hide his research from everyone. Silas's sharp intake of breath made Maya glance toward him, and what she saw in his expression sent ice through her veins. Not surprise, recognition. He knew. "Almost everyone," Silas said quietly, blood still trickling from his temple. "Told you the boy was careful, but not careful enough." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Her father hadn't been a failed prospector chasing desperate dreams in the mountains. He'd been protecting something, a secret that had taken him most of his life to confirm, a secret worth killing for. "The Esperanza Cache," the leader continued, enjoying Maya's obvious confusion. "Spanish gold that never made it back to Mexico. Your father wasn't the first to look for it, but he was the first to actually find it, and the first smart enough to walk away without touching it." Maya's legs felt unsteady. Everything she'd believed about their life in the mountains, about their parents' choices, about why they'd been living in isolation, all of it was a lie. Or not a lie exactly, but a carefully constructed cover for something much larger. He walked away because he knew what happened to treasure hunters who got too greedy, Silas added, his eyes finding Maya's. Knew there were people watching, waiting for someone to do the hard work of locating it. People with more guns than conscience. Sophie whimpered against Maya's shoulder, sensing the adult tension even if she couldn't understand the words. Maya adjusted her grip on her sister and felt the terrible mathematics of their situation crystallizing. Her parents hadn't died in a blizzard. They'd been murdered for information they'd refused to give. Information these men believed Maya possessed. "But 24 months of looking through your father's papers turned up nothing," the leader said. "No maps, no research notes, no coordinates. Almost like he knew someone would come looking eventually." Maya's throat felt dry as bone. Because he did know. Smart girl. Yes, he knew. But parents get sentimental about their children's futures. No one walks away from that much gold without leaving some kind of legacy behind. The map beneath the overturned couch seemed to pulse with dangerous possibility. 3 feet away, close enough to grab if she moved fast enough. But looking at the tactical gear, the professional coordination, Maya understood she was dealing with people who'd planned for every contingency. Except maybe one. "You're wrong," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "My father didn't leave us anything except bills and broken promises. We've been starving in that cabin for 2 years. If there was treasure, don't you think we would have found it by now?" The leader studied her face with uncomfortable intensity. 2 years of survival, impressive for a teenager. But your father was smarter than you're giving him credit for. Smart enough to hide his research somewhere his children would eventually find it, but only when they were old enough to handle the responsibility. Maya felt something shift inside her. Not just fear anymore, but anger. 2 years of brutal survival, of sacrificing everything to keep her siblings alive, while their parents' real legacy lay hidden somewhere in these mountains. 2 years of believing they'd been abandoned when they'd actually inherited something worth killing for. The maps in his grave, she lied desperately. Buried with him. No! Silas's voice cut through her deception like a blade. No, child. It's not. Maya stared at him in horror, watching something she couldn't identify cross his weathered features. Not betrayal exactly, but a resignation that spoke of choices made long before tonight. It's in the place your father trusted most, Silas continued, his eyes holding hers. The place he knew would keep his children safe until they were ready for the truth. Understanding crashed over Maya like an avalanche. The familiar smell on the blankets Silas had left them, the way he'd known exactly where to find their cabin, the perfect timing of his help. You knew them, she whispered. You knew our parents. Silas's smile was sad and proud and infinitely complicated. Child, I didn't just know them. I raised your father from the time he was 12 years old. The world tilted sideways. Everything, the rescue, the cabin, the careful way he'd gained their trust, all of it part of something much larger than charity from a lonely mountaineer. Maya was staring into the eyes of her grandfather. The word hung between them like a bridge Maya wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Grandfather. She'd imagined him dead, or absent by choice, or simply non-existent, one of the many gaps in her parents' carefully guarded history. Not this weathered mountain man, who'd been watching over them with the patient devotion of someone bound by blood. Your father was stubborn, Silas said, his voice carrying decades of complicated affection. Wouldn't let me help directly, wouldn't risk exposing you children to the danger he knew was coming. But he made me promise to watch, to wait, to step in only if... If what? Maya's question came out harsher than intended, anger flaring through her confusion. 2 years. 2 brutal years of believing they were completely alone. If someone came looking for what he found. The leader's impatience crackled through the room like static electricity. Touching family reunion, but we're running out of time. The map, old man. Where is it? Maya watched something change in Silas's expression, a hardening that reminded her powerfully of her father in the moments before he'd made decisions that couldn't be undone. The resemblance was unmistakable now that she knew to look for it. The same stubborn jaw, the same way of going still before committing to action. You want David's research? Silas met the leader's stare without flinching. It's not hidden. Never was. The boy was too smart for dead drops and buried caches. He put it somewhere these men would never think to look. Maya's mind raced through possibilities, trying to decode Silas's meaning while calculating their dwindling options. The twins had pressed themselves against Emma until they seemed like one terrified organism. Michael's breathing had grown more labored, and she could feel fever heat radiating from his small body. Sophie's grip around her neck had tightened to the point of pain. Whatever plan was forming, it needed to happen soon. Her family was running on borrowed time. He memorized it, Silas continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone revealing a carefully guarded secret. 30 years of research, all committed to memory. Locations, landmarks, measurements, every detail your bosses are so eager to find. The leader's expression shifted, and Maya saw the first crack in his professional composure. No one memorizes that much information. David Caldwell did. Silas's smile held no warmth. Taught him the technique myself. Same way my grandfather taught me to remember trap lines and water sources and which valleys stayed passable through winter storms. Mountain survival, passed down through generations. Maya felt a spark of understanding, small but growing. Silas wasn't just buying them time, he was giving her information, teaching her something crucial about her father's methods and her family's capabilities. But David's dead, the leader said, his voice flat with the certainty of someone who'd been there. Is he? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maya watched the men exchange glances, saw doubt creep into their professional confidence. For the first time since the confrontation began, they looked uncertain. Silas pressed his advantage. 2 years you've been searching. Found the cabin, found the children, found me. But you never found David's body, did you? Never found Sarah's either. Maya's world tilted again, hope and disbelief warring in her chest. The blizzard, the desperate search, the terrible acceptance that had finally forced her to stop waiting for her parents' return, all of it based on assumptions rather than proof. The avalanche, she started. Covered their tracks, Silas finished, just like they planned. David knew someone would come eventually, knew they'd watch the children, wait for him to lead them to the gold, so he did the only thing he could do. He disappeared, Maya whispered. They both did. Created a tragedy that would explain their absence while keeping you children safe from questions they couldn't answer. Silas's eyes found hers across the destroyed room. But they didn't abandon you. They've been watching, waiting for the right moment to come home. The leader's patience finally snapped. Enough games. Even if they're alive, even if they're watching, they'll come running if their children are in immediate danger, won't they? Maya saw the gun appear in his hand with the fluid efficiency of professional violence. Saw him turn toward Michael, who was barely staying upright against Lucas's supporting arm. But she also saw something else. The corner of the map beneath the couch had shifted during their conversation, revealing enough handwritten text to confirm its authenticity, her father's careful script, marking locations and measurements with the precision Silas had described. The inheritance that had cost her parents their freedom and might now cost her siblings their lives. Maya made her choice in that instant. Surrounded by the wreckage of temporary safety and the promise of answers she'd waited 2 years to hear. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't let her family be used as leverage again. You want the map? Maya shifted Sophie's weight and took a deliberate step toward the couch. It's right there. The leader's gun swung toward Maya with predatory precision. Stop moving. But Maya had already committed to the motion, her body following through with the desperate momentum of someone who'd spent 2 years making split-second survival decisions. She lunged for the couch, Sophie still clinging to her neck, her free hand grasping for the protruding corner of her father's map. The room exploded into chaos. Silas threw himself sideways in his chair, the wooden legs catching the leader's shin and sending him stumbling. Lucas grabbed Michael and dove toward the kitchen doorway, Emma pushing the twins ahead of him. Maya's fingers closed around the map just as hands seized her shoulders, yanking her backward with enough force to nearly tear Sophie from her arms. "Got it!" The second man's voice carried triumph as he wrenched the papers from Maya's grip. But his victory lasted only seconds before Silas's chair leg, broken free during his fall, caught him across the temple with a sickening crack. Maya rolled away from the falling man, sheltering Sophie with her body as gunfire erupted overhead. Wood splinters rained down from the cabin's support beams. Someone was screaming, Emma or one of the twins, and Maya could hear Lucas shouting instructions from the kitchen. The map scattered across the floor in a dozen pieces, her father's careful handwriting now visible in fragments. Coordinates, elevation markers, sketched landmarks. All the secrets that had cost her family everything now spread like confetti across the blood-stained planks. Enough! The leader's roar cut through the chaos. Everyone stops moving or the little girl gets hurt. Maya froze, still crouched over Sophie, as the barrel of the gun pressed against her sister's blonde curls. Around the room, her siblings went statue still. Even Silas, bleeding from a fresh cut across his cheek, ceased struggling against his restraints. Better. The leader's breathing was ragged, his professional composure finally cracking under the strain of a plan gone sideways. Now we're going to collect these pieces, and you're going to help me understand what your father was trying to tell us. Maya's mind raced through the fragments she'd glimpsed. Her father's handwriting, yes, but something else too, a methodical precision that spoke of years spent refining coordinates, cross-referencing landmarks, building an obsessively detailed picture of something hidden in these mountains. The third man, who'd been silent until now, spoke from his position near the door. "Contact just went dark. We need to move." Maya felt the shift in the room's energy, like a change in barometric pressure. Whatever backup these men had been counting on was no longer available. They were as trapped as her family now, committed to a course of action with no clean exit strategy. "Dad always said the mountain takes what it wants," she whispered, remembering her father's voice during their last winter together. At the time, she'd thought he was talking about the harsh weather, the isolation, the constant struggle for survival. Now she understood. He'd been talking about this moment. "What did you say?" The leader leaned closer, his weapon still pressed against Sophie's head. Maya looked at the scattered map pieces, at Silas's knowing expression, at her siblings huddled in the kitchen doorway. 2 years of brutal survival had taught her to read situations with crystal clarity, to calculate odds and make hard choices in seconds. She was 17 years old, responsible for 6 lives, trapped by armed professionals who needed her family alive only long enough to decode 30 years of hidden research. But she was also David Caldwell's daughter, raised by a man who'd spent decades outwitting people exactly like this. And she had one advantage these men couldn't account for. She'd learned the mountain's lessons firsthand. "I said," Maya repeated, slowly straightening despite the gun's proximity, "the mountain takes what it wants. My father taught me that. He also taught me something else." She met the leader's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd made peace with necessary choices. "He taught me that sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to let everything else burn." The leader's expression shifted as he finally understood what Maya had been doing during their conversation. Not just grabbing for the map, but studying its contents in those crucial seconds. Memorizing what her father had memorized, carrying forward a legacy of survival that ran deeper than treasure or violence. Outside, the wind picked up with the promise of another storm. Maya could hear it in the cabin's timbers, in the way the broken windows whistled, in the distant sound that might have been engines or might have been avalanche warnings echoing through the peaks. The final confrontation was coming, whether they were ready or not, and Maya Caldwell, keeper of her father's secrets and guardian of her family's future, was done running. The leader's finger tightened on the trigger, but Maya was already moving. Not toward the gun or away from it, but in a direction that made no tactical sense until the first explosion shattered the night. The cabin's north wall erupted inward in a shower of splinters and snow. Through the gaping hole stepped 2 figures Maya had mourned for 2 years, their faces grim with the knowledge of violence done and violence yet to come. "Hello, sweetheart," her father said, stepping through the destruction like an avenging ghost. "We're home." David Caldwell moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent months planning this moment. Behind him, Maya's mother emerged from the swirling snow, a rifle in her hands and ice in her eyes. Sarah Caldwell had always been the gentler parent, the one who bandaged scraped knees and sang lullabies. Tonight she looked like someone who'd kill without hesitation to protect her children. The leader spun toward the new threat, his weapon tracking away from Sophie for the crucial second Maya had been waiting for. She threw herself sideways, rolling behind the overturned couch with her sister still clutched against her chest. Around the room, chaos erupted with the force of a long-delayed reckoning. Gunfire exploded from 3 directions. Maya pressed Sophie's face against her shoulder and counted muzzle flashes, trying to track the battle through sound and instinct. Her father's voice cut through the violence, calm and deadly. "Michael, Emma, kitchen, now. Lucas, take the twins and get down." Even in the middle of a firefight, David Caldwell sounded like a father protecting his family. Maya risked a glance over the couch's edge and saw the third man, the one by the door, collapse with a spreading stain across his tactical vest. Her mother worked the rifle's bolt with mechanical efficiency, already tracking toward the second target. 2 years of mountain survival had honed Sarah Caldwell into something harder than the woman who'd disappeared in the blizzard. The leader had taken cover behind Silas's chair, using Maya's grandfather as a human shield while he returned fire. but his tactical advantage was crumbling. The careful plan that had required stealth and patience was now a close-quarters battle against opponents who knew every inch of this terrain. "David!" Silas's voice carried across the gunfire. "Boy's got something in his vest. Deadman switch." Maya's father froze, his weapon still trained on the leader's position. She could see his mind working through possibilities, calculating risks with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to tracking the Esperanza cache. "Remote charges," the leader called out, his voice steady despite the blood running down his face. "Placed throughout the cabin's foundation. I stop breathing. This whole place becomes a crater." The standoff crystallized around that threat. Maya could hear her siblings breathing in the kitchen, could feel Sophie's small heart hammering against her chest. Outside, the wind continued to build, and she wondered if the distant rumbling was thunder or avalanche warnings echoing through the peaks. Her father's expression never changed, but Maya caught the slight shift in his stance that meant he was accepting new parameters. "What do you want?" "The real map. Not the decoy you scattered across the floor." The leader's smile was thin and professional. 30 years of research doesn't fit on a few pieces of paper. "Where's the rest?" Maya watched her parents exchange a look across the destroyed room, the kind of wordless communication that came from decades of shared secrets and shared danger. Her mother's slight nod was barely perceptible, but Maya caught it. Permission to reveal what they'd protected for so long. "There is no other map," David said quietly. "What you found was everything. Coordinates to an empty hole in the ground where Spanish gold was supposed to be buried." The leader's confidence flickered. "That's impossible. The research, the years of chasing shadows," Maya's father interrupted, "following legends that were already picked clean by the 1920s. The Esperanza cache was found and moved decades before I started looking." Maya felt pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. Her father hadn't been protecting treasure. He'd been protecting the truth about treasure that no longer existed. The secret that had cost them 2 years of separation was that there was no secret worth having. "But the people who hired you don't know that," Sarah added, her rifle never wavering. "They've invested too much to accept failure, which is why we had to disappear, why we had to let you believe our children might have inherited something worth killing for." The leader's professional mask finally cracked completely. "You're lying. No one spends 30 years researching nothing." Maya stood slowly, still holding Sophie, understanding flooding through her with the force of revelation. He didn't spend 30 years researching treasure. He spent 30 years researching the people who were looking for it. Her father's slight smile confirmed her guess. David Caldwell hadn't been a treasure hunter at all. He'd been building a comprehensive map of everyone who believed in the Esperanza cache, tracking their methods and resources, learning their weaknesses, learning how to make them disappear into these mountains forever. The final test wasn't about choosing between family and fortune. It was about understanding that sometimes the greatest treasure was knowing which battles were worth fighting. Outside, the avalanche warnings were getting closer. The leader's thumb moved toward the dead man's switch, but Maya was already in motion. 2 years of split-second survival decisions had taught her to act, while others hesitated, and she understood something the armed professionals didn't. Her father had been planning this confrontation since the day he'd faked his own death. "Wait!" she called out, stepping into the open with Sophie still in her arms. "You want to know where the real treasure is? It's not in any map." Every weapon in the room tracked toward her voice. Her father's eyes went wide with parental terror, but Maya pressed forward with the desperate clarity of someone who'd finally understood the game being played. "Maya, get back," her mother started. "No." Maya's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "They've been asking the wrong questions for 30 years. Haven't you?" The leader's finger hesitated on the switch. Professional curiosity warred with survival instinct across his bloodied features. "Explain." Maya felt the weight of 6 lives balanced on her next words. Behind her, she could hear Michael's labored breathing, Emma's whispered prayers, the twins' muffled sobs. Everything she'd fought to protect for 2 brutal winters hung in the balance of this moment. The Esperanza cache was never about gold, she said, pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. It was about information, about people wealthy enough to finance 30-year treasure hunts. Her father's expression shifted from terror to pride to something approaching awe. Maya was solving a puzzle he'd spent decades perfecting, unraveling secrets in real time that had cost her family everything. The Spanish buried their treasure in ledgers, not holes in the ground. Names, accounts, family lines. A network of wealth that survived centuries because nobody knew how to find it. Maya took another step forward, her voice gaining strength. Until now. The leader's weapon wavered. That's impossible. Is it? You've been hunting legends while my father was building a database of everyone desperate enough to kill for them. Every name, every organization, every financial backer who believed in the Esperanza cache. Maya's smile held no warmth. 30 years of research on the kind of people who don't like having their secrets exposed. Behind the leader, Silas began working at his restraints with renewed urgency. Maya caught the movement and understood she needed to keep talking, needed to hold their captor's attention while her grandfather freed himself for whatever final play her father had orchestrated. The real treasure isn't buried treasure, it's buried leverage, the kind of information that makes powerful people disappear inconvenient problems. Maya shifted Sophie's weight, feeling her sister's small arms tighten around her neck. Which is why you're all going to die in these mountains tonight. The leader's professional composure finally shattered completely. You're lying. No teenager figures out what trained investigators missed. No teenager raised in civilization, Maya corrected. But I've spent 2 years learning what my father tried to teach me. That survival isn't about being stronger or smarter than your enemies. It's about understanding the terrain better than they do. Outside, the rumbling she'd been hearing finally resolved into something recognizable, helicopter rotors cutting through the wind. But not rescue helicopters. The sound was wrong, too heavy, too military. Her father heard it too. Maya, everyone down, now. The cabin's remaining windows exploded inward as repelling lines dropped through the darkness. Black-clad figures descended into the chaos, weapons ready, moving with coordination that spoke of extensive planning. But they weren't coming to rescue the leader and his team. They were coming to eliminate witnesses. Maya threw herself behind the couch as automatic weapons fire erupted from above. The leader's deadman switch forgotten, he scrambled for cover as his own backup turned against him. Around the room, her family pressed themselves into whatever protection they could find. This was the final layer of her father's plan, letting his enemies destroy each other while his family escaped through the chaos. Maya understood now why he'd spent 2 years in hiding, why he'd needed Silas to watch over them, why every gift and gesture had been carefully calculated. He hadn't been protecting treasure or secrets. He'd been orchestrating the complete destruction of everyone who threatened his children. Silas broke free of his restraints and lunged toward the kitchen, shouting coordinates Maya didn't understand until she saw her father nod grimly. Somewhere in this cabin was an escape route her parents had prepared years ago, insurance against exactly this kind of betrayal. The leader, bleeding and desperate, raised his weapon toward Sophie one final time. But Maya was already moving, her body a shield between her sister and the gun, 2 years of fierce protection condensed into one desperate moment. The shot that followed came not from the leader's weapon, but from her mother's rifle. Sarah Caldwell's aim was perfect, her face serene with maternal violence. Outside, the mountain's avalanche warnings finally resolved into action. The sound that followed would echo through the peaks until spring, taking secrets and enemies alike into the darkness below. The avalanche hit like the fist of God. Maya felt the mountain move beneath them, a deep primal shudder that preceded the roar by precious seconds. Her father's voice cut through the gunfire with desperate urgency. "Tunnel! Everyone to the tunnel!" Silas had already torn away the false panel behind the wood stove, revealing a narrow passage that dropped into darkness. Maya's parents had spent months preparing for this moment, but no amount of planning could account for the timing of natural disaster. "Go, go, go!" Her father shoved Michael toward the opening as automatic weapons fire continued from above. The black-clad figures rappelling through the windows were shooting anything that moved, their orders clearly leaving no room for prisoners or witnesses. Maya clutched Sophie against her chest and dove for the tunnel entrance. Behind her, she heard Emma scream as debris from the ceiling crashed down where she'd been standing. Lucas grabbed his twin sister, pulling her towards safety as the cabin began to disintegrate around them. The avalanche's roar was building now, a freight train of snow and stone bearing down on their position with unstoppable momentum. Maya dropped into the tunnel and immediately understood the cruel mathematics of their situation. The passage was narrow, designed for careful evacuation, not desperate flight. 6 children, 2 parents, and Silas would need precious minutes they didn't have. "Maya!" Her father's voice carried over the destruction above. "Take Sophie and go. Don't stop. Don't look back." She turned to argue and saw him lifting a bloodied beam off Emma's leg. Her sister was conscious but hurt, unable to move quickly. The twins were crying, Michael was struggling with an asthma attack brought on by dust and terror, and Lucas was trying to help everyone at once. They couldn't all make it. Not at the speed the avalanche demanded. "Dad, no." "That's an order!" David Caldwell's eyes held the same fierce protectiveness Maya had learned from 2 winters alone. "You know this mountain better than anyone. Get Sophie to safety, we'll follow." Maya understood then what victory required. Not treasure or revenge or even justice, but the brutal arithmetic of sacrifice. Someone had to go first, fast and light, to ensure the tunnel's far end was clear. Someone had to scout the route, while others helped the wounded and afraid. Someone had to accept that saving everyone might be impossible. "I love you," she whispered, kissing Sophie's forehead. "All of you." Before anyone could stop her, Maya was running through the darkness. The tunnel sloped downward, following the mountain's natural contours toward some exit her parents had prepared years ago. Behind her, she could hear her family following, but the sounds were growing fainter as the avalanche's roar built to crescendo. The passage ended in a steel door marked with her father's careful handwriting, "Emergency exit, GPS coordinates 47.2 degree, 113.8 degree." Maya threw her weight against the handle and emerged into a snow-filled ravine half a mile from the cabin's location. Above them, the mountain was coming apart. Maya watched in helpless horror as the avalanche consumed the ridgeline where they'd lived, where she'd kept her family alive through 2 brutal winters, where her parents had made their final stand against 30 years of accumulated enemies. Snow and stone and shattered trees filled the air like the breath of some ancient, angry god. The cabin was gone. The men with guns were gone. The helicopter and its deadly cargo were gone, swept away by forces that made human conflicts seem small and temporary. But her family... Sophie was crying now, the sound thin and lost in the mountain's violence. Maya held her sister close and waited, counting seconds that stretched into minutes, praying to anyone who might be listening for the sound of voices in the tunnel behind them. When the first figure emerged from the darkness, Maya nearly collapsed with relief, Lucas supporting Michael between labored breaths. Then the twins, holding hands and covered in dust but alive. Emma limping but moving under her own power. Her parents came last, with Silas between them. The old man's face grey with pain but his eyes bright with stubborn survival. They'd all made it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd all made it. "The cost," her father said quietly, looking back toward where the cabin had been. "Do you understand?" Maya nodded, understanding flooding through her with crystal clarity. The real treasure hadn't been Spanish gold or buried leverage or 30 years of research. It had been time for her family to disappear completely, for their enemies to destroy each other, for the mountain to reclaim all the secrets and violence that had poisoned these peaks for generations. Her father had sacrificed his identity, his freedom, 2 years of his children's lives, and finally the home where she'd learned to survive. The cost of winning had been everything except what mattered most. They were free now, free and alive and together, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the vast Montana wilderness stretching ahead of them. Maya looked up at the star-filled sky and smiled. It was enough. The resolution. The silence that followed the avalanche's fury was almost more overwhelming than the roar had been. Maya stood in the snow-filled ravine, holding Sophie close, listening to the mountain settle into an exhausted quiet. Around her, the scattered pieces of her family slowly found their footing in this new reality, alive, together, but fundamentally changed by what they'd survived. "Is everyone hurt?" her mother asked, the question carrying the weight of 2 years' worth of accumulated fear. Sarah Caldwell moved between her children with methodical care, checking Emma's injured leg, listening to Michael's labored breathing, counting fingers and toes like she had when they were babies. Maya watched her parents work and realized she was seeing them clearly for the first time since their reunion. Not as the vanished figures from her nightmares, not as the larger-than-life heroes who'd orchestrated impossible rescues, but as people who'd paid their own price for the choices they'd made. Her father's hair had gone completely grey. Her mother's hands shook slightly as she examined Emma's wounds. They looked older, worn down by the weight of secrets and separation. "I'm okay," Emma said softly, though she was favoring her left leg, just bruised. Nothing like when Maya had to set Michael's arm that time. The casual reference to their survival without parents hit the group like a physical blow. Maya felt her siblings' eyes turn toward her, recognizing something that hadn't been there before the separation, a quiet authority born from necessity, a way of moving through crisis that their parents hadn't taught her. "You've been taking care of them," Silas observed, settling heavily against a snow-covered boulder. The old mountaineer's face was etched with pain, but his voice carried approval. "Really taking care of them. I tried to help when I could, but you were the one keeping them alive." Maya nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without pride or defensiveness. It was simply fact. Someone had to. Her father approached slowly, as if uncertain of his welcome. "Maya, what you did back there, figuring out the real plan, keeping everyone calm during the fighting, I learned from you," Maya interrupted. "Both of you. Everything I needed to survive, you taught me before you left." The words weren't quite forgiveness, but they weren't accusation either. They were recognition that the skills her parents had given her in 17 years of mountain living had been enough to sustain 6 children through the impossible. That their sacrifice, however painful, had served its purpose. Lucas broke the heavy silence by laughing suddenly, a sound that bordered on hysteria. "So what now? We're officially dead, right? I mean, that cabin got completely buried. Anyone looking for us is going to assume we were inside." "That was the plan," David confirmed quietly. "New identities, new lives, far away from here, somewhere they'll never think to look." Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the Mountaineer. "What about everything else? The research, the people who hired those men, all the enemies you've been tracking for 30 years? Her parents exchanged another of those wordless conversations that spoke of shared understanding. This time, it was her mother who answered. "Gone," Sarah said simply. "Everyone who knew about the Esperanza cache, everyone who believed in it enough to kill for it, they were all in that helicopter or working for the people who were. The avalanche buried the last of it." Silas coughed, a sound that might have been pain or laughter. "Sometimes the mountain solves problems better than people do. All those secrets, all that violence. It's just part of the landscape now, frozen until spring, and probably forgotten by then." Sophie stirred in Maya's arms, mumbling something about being cold. The practical needs of survival were reasserting themselves, pushing aside the larger questions of justice and resolution. They needed shelter, warmth, food, medical attention for Emma's leg and Michael's breathing. They needed to become a family again. "There's a ranger station about 3 miles south," Maya said, falling back into the role that had sustained her for 2 years. "We can reach it before dawn if we're careful. They'll have supplies, communications equipment." "And then?" Emma asked quietly. Maya looked at her parents, these strangers who were also the most familiar people in her world, and realized the answer was still being written. They had survived the immediate danger, escaped the cycle of violence that had trapped them, won their freedom at a cost that would take years to fully understand. But survival was just the beginning. Now they had to learn how to live again. "And then we figure it out together," Maya said, adjusting Sophie's weight against her shoulder. "All of us. No more secrets, no more separation." Her father nodded slowly, acceptance and gratitude warring in his expression. Together. They began walking south through the snow, 8 figures moving carefully through the darkness toward whatever came next. Behind them, the mountain stood guard over its buried secrets, and ahead of them stretched the vast possibility of a life, finally, completely their own. The return. The ranger station appeared through the pre-dawn darkness like a beacon of ordinary life. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, an American flag hung limp in the still air, and warm yellow light spilled from windows that promised heat, safety, and the kind of normalcy Maya had almost forgotten existed. She stood at the edge of the clearing, Sophie still sleeping in her arms, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, the luxury of hesitation. For so long, every decision had been about immediate survival. Find food, stay warm, keep moving. Now, approaching this threshold between their hidden life and the world beyond, she could actually pause to consider what came next. "It's going to be different," her mother said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Everything. The way people look at you, the questions they ask, the assumptions they make about what you've been through." Maya nodded, understanding flooding through her with unexpected clarity. The girl who'd walked into those mountains 2 winters ago, 17, sheltered, dependent on parents for every major decision, no longer existed. The person who would walk out was someone else entirely, hardened by responsibility, shaped by choices no teenager should have had to make, marked by knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. "I know," Maya said. "I'm not the same." Behind them, her siblings were having their own reckonings with the approaching return to civilization. The twins whispered together in the shorthand they'd developed during the long, isolated months. Michael walked with the careful breathing of someone who'd learned to manage his asthma without inhalers. Emma limped, but didn't complain, her face set in lines that belonged on someone much older. Lucas caught up with Maya at the clearing's edge. "You saved us," he said simply. "Not just tonight, but every day for 2 years, we all know it." "We saved each other," Maya corrected, but she felt the weight of his acknowledgement. Leadership had been thrust upon her by necessity, and she'd accepted it because the alternative was unthinkable. Now, with their parents returned, and the immediate danger past, she wondered what would happen to the person she'd become. Her father approached the ranger station door first, his hand hesitating over the radio that would summon helicopters, medical attention, social workers, and questions they weren't prepared to answer. The identities he'd mentioned, new lives far from Montana, would require time to arrange, official procedures that could take weeks or months. "Maya?" He turned to her with an expression she'd never seen before, a parent asking his child's permission. "Are you ready?" She looked back at her family, these 6 people who'd depended on her for everything, who'd trusted her with their lives when no one else could. They were watching her now with the same expectation, still seeing her as the person who made the hard decisions, who figured out what came next. For a moment, Maya felt the crushing weight of that responsibility. But then Sophie shifted in her arms, murmuring contentedly, and she understood something fundamental. She didn't have to carry them anymore, but she would never stop being the person who could. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. "We're ready." The radio crackled to life, her father's voice calm and controlled as he reported their location, their medical needs, their request for evacuation. Maya listened to him navigate the questions. A family separated by the avalanche, hiking equipment lost, children who needed attention but nothing life-threatening. The lies came easily now, smoothed by years of practice. But they weren't really lies, Maya realized. They were just a different version of the truth, one shaped to protect rather than expose. Within an hour, the helicopter's rotors were cutting through the morning air. Maya watched it approach and felt something loosen in her chest, not relief exactly, but recognition. This was what coming home looked like, not returning to a place, but returning to the possibility of safety. As paramedics checked Emma's leg and listened to Michael's breathing, as officials asked gentle questions about their ordeal and made notes about temporary housing, Maya found herself observing it all with the detached clarity of someone who'd learned to assess every situation for hidden dangers. But there were no dangers here, just people doing their jobs, systems designed to help families in crisis, the machinery of a world that would embrace them without ever knowing what they'd truly survived. Silas caught her eye as they were loading into separate vehicles for the trip to town. The old mountaineer looked like himself again, concerned citizen, helpful neighbor, mountain guide who'd assisted in a rescue. All traces of the harder man who'd helped orchestrate their escape had disappeared behind practiced normalcy. "You did good, girl," he said quietly. "Your grandpa would have been proud." Maya nodded, understanding this was goodbye. Silas would fade back into the mountains, and they would disappear into new lives, new names, new possibilities. The connection between them would remain unspoken but unbroken. As the helicopter lifted them away from the peaks that had shaped her, Maya pressed her face to the window and watched Montana shrink below them. Somewhere in that vast wilderness lay the buried remnants of their old life. The cabin where she'd learned to be strong, the trails where she'd hunted for food, the hiding places where she'd kept her family safe. She was leaving all of that behind, but she was taking something irreplaceable with her, the unshakable knowledge of who she'd become when everything else fell away, the new beginning. 6 months later, Maya stood in the kitchen of their new house in Missoula, watching Emma help the twins with homework at the dining room table. Sunlight streamed through windows that weren't boarded against wind, warming a space that smelled of coffee and her mother's cooking instead of wood smoke and survival. The transformation should have felt like victory. They had new names, new histories, carefully crafted by people who specialized in such things. Maya Elena Rodriguez now, with a birth certificate that placed her childhood in Colorado, school records that explained the gaps in her education as homeschooling in remote areas. Her siblings had adapted to their new identities with the resilience that had carried them through 2 winters of impossibility. But Maya found herself studying her reflection in the window, seeing someone caught between worlds. The girl who'd learned to skin rabbits and read weather patterns still lived behind her eyes, even as she attended senior year at a high school where her biggest worry was supposed to be college applications. "You're thinking too hard again," Lucas said, appearing beside her with the quiet step he'd developed during their hiding years. At 15, he was taller than she was now, but he still sought her approval for decisions that parents should handle. Old habits died hard. "Just watching," Maya said, accepting the cup of tea he offered. Another small luxury that still felt strange, having enough for extras, for comfort rather than necessity. Her parents were in the living room with a social worker who visited monthly, part of the elaborate fiction that positioned them as a family recovering from an off-grid lifestyle that had ended badly. Maya listened to her mother's carefully practiced story about becoming isolated, about recognizing the children needed more opportunities, about gratefully accepting help from various agencies. Sarah Caldwell, now Rodriguez, had become remarkably good at playing the role of a woman relieved to rejoin civilization, but Maya caught her sometimes staring at the mountains visible from their backyard with an expression that mixed loss and longing in equal measure. "Maya?" Sophie appeared at her elbow, 13 now and growing into features that would break hearts someday. "Can you check my math homework? Mom's busy." The request was automatic, born from years when Maya had been the only teacher available. But now it carried choice rather than desperation. Maya could say yes because she wanted to help, not because Sophie would fail without her intervention. They settled at the kitchen counter, Sophie's algebra spreading between them. These were problems with clean solutions, equations that balanced perfectly when you applied the right principles. Maya found herself missing the brutal honesty of mountain survival, where success meant staying alive and failure was immediately obvious. "You're getting better at this," Maya said, checking Sophie's work. "Remember when you thought fractions were impossible?" Sophie grinned, the expression lighting up features that had been too serious for too long. "Remember when we thought having enough firewood was impossible?" The casual reference to their hidden years sent a small shock through Maya. They'd all agreed to leave that life unspoken, buried as deeply as the cabin under Montana snow, but sometimes the past surfaced in small moments, shared glances, automatic responses that belonged to different people. "Different kind of impossible," Maya said carefully. Her father emerged from the living room after the social worker left, his shoulders carrying the particular tension that came with maintaining elaborate deceptions. David Rodriguez worked construction now, his mountain skills translating into honest labor that paid enough to support 8 people in modest comfort. "How did it go?" Maya asked. "Fine. Good. She thinks we're adjusting well." He paused, studying his daughter with the careful attention she remembered from before their separation. "How are you adjusting?" "Really?" Maya considered the question seriously. She'd learned not to offer easy answers when people asked how she was doing. The truth was complicated, layered with loss and gratitude and a bone-deep understanding that safety was temporary, precious, never to be taken for granted. "I miss the clarity," she said finally. "When survival was the only goal, everything made sense." Her father nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I'm trying to figure out what comes after survival. Who I'm supposed to be when no one's depending on me for everything." "You're supposed to be 17, he said gently. "You're supposed to worry about prom and college applications and whether that boy in your chemistry class likes you back." Maya laughed, the sound carrying only mild bitterness. "Do you really think that's possible?" Before he could answer, Michael burst through the back door, breathless with excitement rather than asthma for once. "Maya, come see! There's a hawk family nesting in the big cottonwood, 3 babies, and they're almost ready to fly." She followed him outside, drawn by enthusiasm that reminded her why everything they'd sacrificed had been worthwhile. The hawk's nest was visible from their small deck, a testament to wildness persisting even in suburban spaces. As Maya watched the young hawks testing their wings, she understood something fundamental about her own transformation. She would never be the girl who worried only about ordinary teenage problems, but she could be someone who'd learned extraordinary strength and chose to use it for ordinary happiness. The mountain had shaped her into someone capable of anything. Now she got to decide what anything meant. Behind her, she heard her family's voices mingling in the kitchen, homework questions, dinner plans, the gentle arguments of people who had time for such luxuries. They were building something new together, not just surviving but actually living. Maya smiled and went inside to help with dinner, carrying her hard-won wisdom lightly, like a gift rather than a burden.